Educators Lead, episode 136.
The greatest learning takes place when the ownership of that learning passes from the teacher to the student. And the student's going, I own this project, I own this paper. And now they're incentivized to come up with creative ways to get the job done.
Welcome to Educators Lead, where we interview leaders in education to offer inspiration and practical advice to help launch educators into the next level of leadership. I'm your host, Jay Willis, and I want to thank you for subscribing to our show.
This is John Lee Dumas of EO Fire, and you're listening to Educators Lead. Let's join my friend Jay Willis and get ready to take your leadership to the next level.
Hello, EduLeaders. Jay Willis here, and I'm excited to introduce our featured guest today, Tim Elmore. Tim, are you ready?
I am ready.
Awesome. Dr. Tim Elmore is the president of Growing Leaders, a nonprofit leadership training and development organization that equips students to be leaders in their classrooms, communities, and ultimately their careers. Tim helps guide the parents, educators, mentors, coaches, and employers that lead this generation. Tim has also authored more than 30 books, including Habitudes, Images that Form Leadership Habits and Attitudes, Artificial Maturity, Helping Kids Meet the Challenge of Becoming Authentic Adults, Generation IY, Secrets to Connecting with Today's Teens and Young Adults in the Digital Age, as well as his latest book, Marching Off the Map, which will help educators understand Generation Z and how to teach and lead them. So that's just a real brief introduction, Tim, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, thanks, Jay. It's great to be with you on this program. I think we're very like-minded in how we think and what we want to do with the emerging generation. I started teaching high school students in 1979, so that's been quite a few years ago. So I feel like I've seen the latest of the baby boomers come through, and then Gen X, and then millennials, and now Generation Z.
Wow. So
4 generations. But obviously there are things that just remain the same with human development and adolescent development. You know, their kids are kids. But boy, it just seems like the world is so different now than when I first began my career. So in the Marching Off the Map book, we really just talk about not just the incremental changes, but the exponential changes that have taken place. So 4 years into my journey in 1983, I went on staff with Dr. John C. Maxwell. And for those that don't know that name, John is a New York Times bestselling author in leadership. He's taught corporate leaders for decades now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've read a lot of his books. I've been following him for a long time. Yeah.
Well, I started with him in when I was 23 years old.
Wow.
So I really, I'm just so grateful to have that mentoring. But all the while John was teaching corporate leaders leadership, I kept thinking, what would happen if we could get this to the kids? You know, before they've made any mistakes or horrible mistakes, you know, and ruined a company or a marriage or whatever. So our organization, Growing Leaders, is all about helping people like you and I equip the emerging generation to thrive in their careers, to be leaders, to think like leaders. And by the way, when I say that, I don't mean it's about power or position. We just believe leaders in their essence solve problems and serve people. So we're trying to help students do that well, and we're having a ball doing it. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, and so I want to dig in and talk about kind of your journey that brought you to where you're at and some of the lessons you learned along the way. I guess before we get into that, what would be maybe something interesting about yourself that most people wouldn't know?
Probably the most interesting thing, I'm guessing, would be that I was in a plane crash.
Oh, wow.
And I'm still living, still breathing. So what happened years ago, I was in New Zealand, and I was teaching students there. But I got off a commercial airliner, climbed onto a single engine plane, a private plane. There were 3 others, so a total of 4 of us in the plane, and we crash landed on a field. And it was, needless to say, it was a very memorable experience. But my goodness gracious, you never have students paying attention so much as you climb onto a stage right after you've come out of a plane crash. So just the next day, I was well enough. I was kind of on crutches, but I continued doing the teaching I was there for. But needless to say, I feel very mortal now, and am thankful for every day I've got on this planet.
So, having gone through a few kind of events like that throughout my life, what would you say? I know that there are some just amazing lessons that you kind of take with you. What would you say was probably the greatest lesson that you walked away with that day?
Wow. Oh gosh, I don't know about that particular day, but I would say one of the greatest lessons that I've learned, I guess maybe that day, but for sure since that time, would be that in the relationships of our lives, and certainly with our students that we teach, we need to play chess, not checkers. Jay, it's actually one of our habitudes. Habitudes are images that form leadership habits and attitudes. It's a picture. So the game of chess and checkers, right? They both have the same game board, black and red squares. So you might be tempted to think, it's the same game. But that's far from the truth. When you play checkers, all your pieces move alike. Same color, same shape, same size. And so you treat them all alike. In chess, if you have any hope of winning the game, you have to know what each piece can do. That a bishop goes this way and a queen goes this way and a knight. So I simply say in the relationship of your life, you shouldn't play checkers. You need to play chess. You need to connect with others at the uniqueness of their strength and their personality, and let the bishop be the bishop and the queen be the queen and the rook be the rook. But I think everybody that hears me say this gets it. They know, people are unique. They're different. We need to lead them differently. But even though we know it, we don't do it well, because I think most of the time checkers is an easier game to play and it's a quicker game to play. And I have just found that as I train and teach, I've got to really read the people before I lead the people. And it's especially true about students.
Right. Well, so I guess, for people who may not be familiar with your story, if you don't mind, maybe start from the beginning and talk about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I mentioned I started teaching in 1979, and then in 1983 started with John Maxwell. I would say in the years that followed that, Jay, my love of teaching students and my love of students and my love of leadership really became combined. So throughout the 1990s, I really felt this merging taking place. And in 2003, fast forward, I had been with Maxwell for 20 years. And I launched Growing Leaders to specifically focus on equipping the emerging generation that are certainly getting great academic teaching, math and reading and science and so forth, but very often the life skills and the leadership qualities that I think are just so necessary upon graduation. And for some, before graduation, we want to just help educators get that right. So we're not the only show in town. We know there's so many great things going on, but we now partner with a little over 8,000 middle school, high school, colleges across the country, athletic departments, professional teams. I know where you live. We partner with the Houston Rockets, and we love helping coaches and teachers and administrators connect with the emerging generation so they can really become all that they were meant to be.
Right. Wow. So you worked with John Maxwell for 20 years, you said?
Yeah.
20 years. Yeah. Wow. So what was that like? I'm sure you had a chance to have some interaction with him directly. Oh, yeah. So what was it like working with John Maxwell and his organization?
Well, it was, I got to tell you, it was amazing. In fact, I always tell people today, if I don't do a good job, it's my own fault, because I had mentors like John in my life who just from the get-go. And if you think about it, back in 1983, 84, John really wasn't famous yet. He was known a little bit, but he had time for about 3 or 4 of us to really mentor and spend time with. So I feel like millions of lessons, not just that he taught me with his words, but he modeled in his life. And I just feel like I'm always going back and saying, what would John do in this situation? And it was just so helpful. And John is very much the same way off the stage as he is on the stage. Maybe one more comment I would say, I think I learned over the years, you either thrived with John or you died. In other words, it's so high-paced, fast-paced, high energy that you either say, this is not these are not my people here, or you said, this is awesome. And for me, it was just a great place an energizing place to serve. We were always stretched. We always were better at the end of the year than we were at the beginning of the year, each year. So I count it as one of my greatest blessings to have been a part of that journey.
Right. I think my first exposure to his material was the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership.
Yeah.
That was a great book. And,
absolutely great. Yeah, it was fun to be a part of the creation of that book too.
Oh, wow. That would be really neat. Yeah, I've heard some friends of mine who've actually worked closely with him have talked about just the way that he is kind of always taking notes and how he keeps those fairly organized, like in Evernote and different ways for his next book. So like, you know, for him to come up with a book, he's already got all of the research. He just continues to capture it and keep it well organized over time. And so whenever it's time to actually write the next one, it's kind of all in one spot, ready to go. So
yeah. And that's what he passed on to me. I've got files and files and files and folders of content. So it's so rich to be in that lifelong learning. You know, we all say that, but I think he really trained me to be a lifelong learner. And hence all the books that he's written, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and so I want to jump into your latest book here in a second, but I guess, you know, one of the biggest questions that's been burning on my mind, especially having had a chance to work with John Maxwell and just thinking about just kind of mulling over leadership for the length of time that you have. Like, I know this is kind of a simple question and maybe it's not a simple answer, but what would you say are some of the biggest areas of weakness that you see in like people who are aspiring to become leaders? Like, what do you feel like is kind of you know, if you were to identify like one or two areas that you really feel like are kind of the biggest struggle areas, what would they be?
Boy, two things come to my mind immediately, Jay. One of them is a fundamental lesson that you'll immediately identify with and say, yep, that's true. And in fact, it's so known that sometimes I think we miss it because it seems like old news. But the lesson is people do what people see. So you can have all the greatest lessons and training and teaching and, you know, you can be the greatest speaker in the world and motivate people and give them goosebumps when you speak. But if you're not embodying what you've taught, if you're not living the life, you know, if you're not practicing what you preach, can I say it that way? Then it's all for naught. Our message becomes hollow. And sometimes we completely drain any power from the words that we've used because our lives are not a reflection of what we're taught. So that would be one. I think we live in a day where information is passed so rapidly and there's so much information available. We think we can just say something and it will change people's lives. I don't know if I believe that. The words are certainly important, no doubt about it. But I think when people see our lives, it will either accelerate the influence of our words or it will do just the opposite. It will de-accelerate it. It will drain the power of our words because they go, you're not even doing what you're telling us to do. And boy, isn't it true? Kids can spot a fake a mile away. So that would be one. The other lesson that I think about, maybe a little less intuitive, but when I meet new leaders that are kind of just embarking on their career and wanting to be leaders, perhaps in whatever industry they're in, particularly education, I would say the ability to adapt. Because we live in a day of such rapid change, we are people that are pacing in front of the microwave oven. It's ridiculous today. But because we're in such a day, I think it's easy to, to just say things and not really embody them. But secondly, to perhaps to not be adapting as quickly as we need to adapt. So right when we master something, we need to be willing to say, well, I mastered that this past year, but you know, the new year's upon us. And what are we going to do here? And it may be I've got to do something very, very different. So another one of our images that I love to pass on is called the bit market. Here's the story behind the bit market. It's such a great analogy. So there was a brand new president of a drill company that sold electric drills and drill bits. On his first day on the job, the vice presidents wanted to have a meeting and they just wanted to boast to their new president how great this company was. And one VP after another stood up at the podium and just bragged about how they were selling 60% of the drill bits sold in America. They were sure that their future was bright. When they got done, the president stepped up to the podium and he smiled and he said, "Gentlemen, thank you for those speeches. Those were great speeches." But after a pregnant pause, he said this: "You're just forgetting one thing. There's no market for drill bits. The market is for holes. And the moment someone comes up with a better way to make a hole, drill bits will be obsolete." And he's right, isn't he? We so fall in love with the drill bit that we're making right now, the method that we're using, the pedagogy we're using, whatever it is, that we lose sight of the fact that methods come and go. Mission stays the same. Drills come and go. The hole stays the same. Programs come and go. Purpose stays the same. So I think if I was to share one lesson, it would be, don't get married to a method, fall in love with a mission, and then be willing to adapt as quickly as needed to make sure this is the best way to drill a hole in a piece of wood. I'll stop there right there.
Yeah, no, that's great. That is lots of wisdom in those two things that you just mentioned. I guess, going back to leading by example, if there's somebody listening to this and says, "Oh, that's really good. That's awesome." I probably for a while have been more focused on my words than I have been my actions. Like, where would you start? What if there's somebody listening who realizes that I've heard before, I think it's maybe I don't know where it came from, but paper tiger is kind of what sometimes people are referred to, where they look great on the outside, but like there's not a lot of depth to it.
Yeah, well, clearly, I think it's us being very intentional on working with our own integrity and character. I mean, that often sounds like an elementary school word or a middle school word, but we as adults, I mean, think about what's going on in the world around us. The sexual misconduct stuff we're seeing, it's just awful. It's humanity at its worst. But I'm thinking, these are grown-ups, not children, doing this problem, having this problem. So that would be one thing. I would also say, though, I think it's just important before I dish out some information or some challenge to a colleague or a student to ask myself quietly, maybe silently, am I doing this myself? Am I living up to this myself? One of my favorite stories about this very thing just came to my mind. You remember the name Mahatma Gandhi?
Oh, yeah.
This great Indian leader from decades ago.
Right.
Well, in the 1940s, when he was leading his peaceful revolution in India, Gandhi had a woman come up to him one day with her little daughter, who was probably 5 or 6 years old. And the mother said, "Gandhi, would you tell my little girl to stop eating so much sugar? She has a sweet tooth and she's eating way too much sugar." Well, Gandhi just kind of scratched his chin and said, "No, come back in 2 weeks." And she goes, "What? Just tell her now." He goes, "No, come back in 2 weeks." So the mother, begrudgingly walks away. 2 weeks later, she shows up with her little girl. This time, Gandhi gets down on his knees and looks her in the eye and tells the little girl to stop eating so much sugar. When he's finished, the mother looks at him and says, "Why didn't you tell her 2 weeks ago?" And very wisely, Gandhi said, "Because 2 weeks ago, I ate too much sugar." His point was, I'm not going to dish out any advice if I'm not living it myself. So maybe as educators, we just need to be thinking, am I really actually trafficking unlived truth right now? Or am I doing what I'm saying? Can I share an example from my own life in history class today? I just feel like we must never get away from that. In our 30s, our 40s, our 50s, our 60s, may our students always look at us and say, well, they did what they said. That's I just think, a paramount truth for us to keep getting reacquainted with.
Wow, yeah. Well, so let's talk about your newest book here. I guess. So what's the name of your newest book again?
Yeah, it's called Marching Off the Map.
Okay, so I guess what was the journey to this book, and then what's it all about?
Oh my gosh, Jay, you're going to have to stop me. I'll try to do this in sound bites. I am extremely excited about the content of this book, not because I wrote it, but because it was so much fun gathering and processing and helping a parent or a teacher or a coach process what's coming in the future. Well, first of all, the name I love, Marching Off the Map. It kind of paints a picture, doesn't it? I actually got the phrase from Alexander the Great. We all remember reading about Alexander the Great in world history class. So Alexander was famous for gathering 3 armies and marching across the known world, conquering every bit of territory along the way. But he didn't stop there. He was known to continue marching into the unknown world, a world in which they did not even have maps yet. In fact, he was known to frustrate some of his soldiers because he transformed them into map makers. They were literally mapping as they marched into new territories, noting where the lakes were and the valleys and the hills. And I'm just thinking, boy, does that sound like where we are today in the world of education. We're mapping as we march ahead. We're figuring out realities as we go. You know, this is the first generation of kids that doesn't need adults to get information. I mean, that's just crazy. You know, the teachers used to be the grand brokers of all the data. You know, we knew and they didn't. Well, now that's not true. Thank you, Google. They don't need you for information, but they do need you for interpretation. Let me help you make sense of all that you know. Let me give context to all the content. And by the way, I think that's what plagues us today. All of us, we got content without context. So the book really is about what are we going to do as we march into brand new territory, ready or not, and how do we make sense of making new maps for those who come behind us and really for ourselves. By the way, real quick, let me give you a snapshot of why this is so important.
Sure.
You and I both remember, Jay, the 1990s, okay? In the 1990s, Blockbuster Video was on top of the world. Yep. You know, they were just emerging and, oh my gosh, video cassettes and then DVDs and OMG, this is amazing. Well, one of their customers, a guy named Reed Hastings, rented a video. In fact, it happened to be Apollo 13, and he lost it. He lost it, I think, between the seat cushions of his couch, and it was weeks before he found it, and he was so embarrassed. But he took the video back, and the charge for the late rental was astronomical. And he drove back home, and he said, I had two thoughts driving back home. He said, number one, how am I going to explain this to my wife that I just got charged, all this money for returning a late video? But then he said, I was preoccupied with the thought, there's got to be a better way to rent videos. And Reed Hastings came up with the idea of Netflix. And he went to Blockbuster with the idea. And Blockbuster heard this idea called Netflix, and they go, nah, we're doing fine. Well, may I just say, Blockbuster's not doing so fine today. I don't know when the last time I was, when I saw. And Netflix is doing quite well. That's a picture. So the hole that we're trying to drill is entertainment. The drill bit was video cassettes, DVDs. Now it's streaming. We need to be willing to trade out, how we get the content, but are we willing to, to do that as educators? So in Marching Off the Map, I talk about the rapid rate of change that we're going through and how we must not be reacting. We must be proactive, seeing what's coming and preparing our kids to graduate from school and perhaps be ready for a job that doesn't even exist today. So I'll stop there for now and let you
Well, no, I was curious to know, if you could give us kind of like a snapshot, like a Cliff's Notes version of the book, maybe just extract a few of the ideas. What would be some of the key things to take away? Okay,
good. This is going to be fun. I think I can do this in a soundbite. Early in the book, I talk about Margaret Mead. Do you remember that name? She was arguably the most famous anthropologist in the 20th century.
Right.
We often quote Margaret Mead. She said in one of her books that she wrote in the 1970s that she saw the human race going through three eras, three stages of human history, if you will. The first one she called the post-figurative society. Now think with me, Jay. In the post-figurative society, which took place, by the way, millenniums ago, the adults figured out life for the children and dictated it to the kids. Mm-hmm. And the kids figured out life post, meaning afterwards. So if you were growing up millenniums ago, your mom and dad would choose your marriage partner for you. Good luck with that. Mm-hmm. They would choose your job and career for you. If you were a son, you probably did what dad did. If you were a daughter, you probably did what mama did. And you were to perpetuate the customs and traditions year after year, century after century. That was the post-figurative world. And that went on for a long time. Then, with the dawn of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the Renaissance, we went through a stage that Margaret Mead called the co-figurative society. Because reason became king during that period, the emerging adult and the established adult figured out life together because we could reason things out. We would logic things out. In fact, we launched our country, the United States of America, during this period of time. What did we say in the very beginning? We hold these truths to be
self-evident.
Self-evident, yeah. It was reasonable. So now we were in a little bit different day. Reason became the criteria with which we judged everything. So now you might have a say in your job. You might have a say in your marriage partner, in your career, in your future. But Margaret Mead almost prophetically said way back in the 1970s, 45, 50 years ago, she said, I see us moving into the prefigurative society. And she said this because with the rapid pace of change, I know I've said that already, with the introduction of new media, new technology so fast, the emerging generation is going to figure it out faster than the established adult. And in so many ways, I feel like very, very soon, if not now, we're living in this day. Our preschoolers intuitively understand the iPad. Did you know 90% of 4-year-olds are on technology? It's crazy. And you know what? This is anecdotal, but can I just illustrate here?
Yeah.
When something goes wrong with my iPhone, you know who I hand it to, don't you? It's my children.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, my son, who's 25, he fixes it in 5 minutes. And I go, how did you know to do that? And he will say, how did you not know? I mean, that's the conversations we have at our house. So I'm being silly here, but all I'm saying is, how do we teach in a world, a prefigurative world where the kids are going to probably intuitively understand where the future's going before we are, and we're going to be grasping what was, not what's coming, holding on for dear life. Don't you know people like this? I'm tempted to be like this.
Right.
So don't want to lose what was taught by our grandparents and those virtues and values. And so let me just share this one thought, and I'll let you volley back. So one of the big messages of the Marching Off the Mat book is, how do we become both timely and timeless? Timely meaning, how do I understand what's happening in culture and stay relevant for the world that's coming and be able to instruct students who are going to be, graduating into a very, very different world than the one I graduated into. But at the same time, timeless, meaning what is it from our heritage and our past that we don't want to lose? There are timeless virtues. I know that sounds old-fashioned, but there are timeless values. I'll give you a good example. I was in front of university students not very long ago, and I said to them, as an employer, students, I will always hire a disciplined employee over an undisciplined one, every time. Mm-hmm. I will always hire an honest employee over a dishonest one, every time. Now, I know that sounds cliche, but I'm just saying, I think, Jay, you and I would agree, there's a handful, maybe not a lot, but there's a handful of timeless qualities that we want our kids to get.
Right.
So how do we, in a timely way, with a timely pedagogy, deliver those timeless truths that we don't want them to lose? And that's what the book is about, how to be timely and timely. And I'll go back to Alexander the Great. Even though Alexander the Great was going into brand new territory, you can bet your bottom dollar he found water, because water's timeless. We always need water. He found food. We always need food. So there was a timely and a timeless piece to that new land he was marching in. And that's what I'm trying to help parents and educators and coaches get in this book.
Right. Well, you've definitely set the hook. I'm very curious. Like, what's the answer? How do you do that?
Yeah. I tell you what, I won't go into it long because I know we're limited on time. But in brief, I would say I talk in one of the chapters about having, I call it swing sets and plumb lines. So, when you hop on a swing, or you take your child and your child sits on a swing and they say, "Daddy, swing me." What do they always say right from the beginning? Swing me higher, swing me higher. Every kid in America says that.
Yeah.
Well, you and I both know that in order to swing them forward higher, you must swing them backwards better, right? The more backwards you go, the more forward you can go. Mm-hmm. I think we owe it to the future and to our children to swing backwards well, to look backwards and say, what is it from our past that we don't want to lose? What were the original questions we were trying to answer, problems we were trying to solve when this school started, when this organization started? So it's going backwards very well. And I actually line out what some of the questions are we need to ask ourselves from the past so that we can ask really good questions going forward. What are the new problems we need to solve? If Horace Mann back in 1849 was trying to get kids ready for the norms of society, in the Industrial Revolution, what would he say today if he was starting the public school system today and starting fresh? So that's the swing set part. The plumb line part, I love this part. In a nutshell, you know what a plumb line is. That's a string or a cable that has a weight tied to the end of it.
Right.
And fishermen or sailors will use it. They can, stick it in the water and it will plumb the depths of the water to show you how deep it is. So plumb lines are about depth. But then plumb lines are also about accuracy. You know that builders would often hold a plumb line right next to a wall that they had just constructed. And as they hold it next to the wall, they can see if it's crooked. They can say, we're 1 inch off at the bottom. See, because gravity pulls the line straight down and we can see when we're crooked. I think every school and every teacher and every leader and every parent needs to have a plumb line that they're holding up next to their work and say, you know what? We're not doing what we said we were going to do. We're not straight here. We've gotten crooked. And so I'll just stop there. I know I'm kind of waxing eloquent here, but I just talk about how do we construct swing sets and plumb lines so we can move it into the future with great accuracy and great excellence.
No, that's great. Well, so I guess if somebody were to buy the book and sit down and read it, over a period of time, what would you want them to walk away with after they've finished it?
Well, I actually provide a chapter toward the end where I talk about going back with a plan. So let's say an educator that's an educational leader, let's say they're a teacher leader, they say, I've read this book and I love it, but I'm going back to my principal now and I've got to convince them. I actually talk about how do you go back and in a healthy way, not just force feed, this new idea, but to say, how do I beta test this? How do I, shoot bullets before cannonballs, and start small. And so I really talk about coming away with a plan. In fact, the book, Marching Off the Mat, actually comes with a travel guide where you can scribble notes and literally write out a game plan from what you learned in the book. And how do we lead with Generation Z, who is a different generation than the millennials that we've been talking about now for 17 years. So I really try to give them information, but then give them a guide to kind of help them process their own application.
Right. Now, so I know that you've worked with lots of different, just kind of understanding the different generations and interacting well together. So I have kind of a question out of my own curiosity that's been burning on my mind. Like, how, kind of a couple of them. I guess the first one would be how to effectively, motivate and, to inspire, lead, motivate the, millennial generation, the Generation Y.
Yeah. Well, I think motivation might be, there are going to be some innuendos or nuances that are different between millennials and Gen Z, but the fundamental quality, I believe, can be summarized in the word metacognition. And I actually have a chapter on metacognition. It's a word that's sweeping the higher education world by storm right now. Metacognition is thinking about your thinking. And what it is, rather than dishing out lesson plans in a classroom to our students and asking them to merely write out what we've taught so they can test well, in December or May, I talk about how do we give ownership of the learning to the student. I'm going to contend, and I think you would agree, Jay, but the greatest learning takes place when the ownership of that learning passes from the teacher to the student. And the student's going, I own this project, I own this paper, I own this thing that I'm doing right now. And now they're incentivized to come up with creative ways to get the job done, not just say, spoon feed me, teacher, spoon feed me. So I believe that we've got to be able to do metacognition in the classroom better. And I think the best teachers do that, whatever the subject is, science, math, reading, spelling, you name it. I think the best teachers do it. In the book, I actually try to give some examples of how it can be done with different students and different subjects.
Right. Well, and so what would you say is the key? Because you've had a chance to work with baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, and now Gen Z. So what do you think the key is to people from different generations working well together?
Yeah. Wow. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to use another one of our one of our Habitude images. It's called stethoscopes and treatments.
Okay.
So Jay, that before a good doctor ever provides a treatment or a prescription, he or she is first going to pull out their stethoscope and listen to your heart. In fact, they're going to say, show me your eyes, show me your ears, open your mouth. They're going to go through 10, 15 minutes of diagnosis before they ever do a prescription. I think leaders are going to need to do the same thing. If you're mixing it up with different generations, your colleagues are one age, your students are another age, the supervisor or the administrator is a whole nother age, I think we need to pull out the stethoscope and say, who am I interacting with right now? And before I ever come up with an idea and dish it out to somebody, I've got to say, let me listen to your heart. Let me hear you. I actually have come to believe that people do not have the innate need to get their own way. I do think they have the innate need to be heard. And so I would say, as you mix it up with people, there's almost a lost art today of listening and really hearing and processing what someone's saying. I think we earn our right to speak into the life of someone, particularly a student, if we've listened first. So that would be one. I mean, there's a million things that could be said from people far wiser than I, but I think that's just one of the fundamentals I need to keep telling myself, because I want to just jump into the answer rather than do a diagnosis first.
Right. Well, so that's the stethoscopes. So the treatments, is that kind of along the same lines? Well,
yeah. So stethoscope and treatment is all about taking the time to do the diagnosis before you prescribe a treatment, and the treatment will be whatever you come up with.
Right.
So one of the phrases I use in the stethoscopes and treatment chapter of the Habitudes books is context explains conduct. Now let me explain that. You and I both know that we might see, let's say, a student behave in a certain way. We might go, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Now, we wouldn't say it out loud, but, we've thought that thought, that why would they do that?
Right.
Why would that teenager do such a dumb thing? But then we hear the backstory and we go, oh, no wonder.
Yeah, the context has so much to do with what's really going on. Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, well, so I there's so many things I could ask, but I know for the sake of time, I'm going to roll through some rapid fire questions if you're ready for those.
I think so. I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah.
So first off, what would you say is the best leadership advice you've ever received?
Oh my gosh. Well, working under John Maxwell, I got a ton. I would say one simple answer, but I think is pretty profound, is people do what people see. I think I mentioned that earlier, that if I'm going to expect anyone to follow my lead, I better do it first.
Right.
They won't do what I say. In fact, all the parents listening right now, think about it. Children do what children see.
Right.
So you could talk to your kids about being punctual, but if you're 8 minutes late to every, whatever family gathering, they're going to show up 8 minutes late.
Yeah.
So I would say that's my rapid fire answer to that one.
So what would you say is your biggest strength as a leader?
Probably communicating vision. I love communication. You can probably tell. I don't know if I'm good at it, but I think it's something I love to do. And I love to use metaphors and imagery to communicate a truth that sticks in the brain. That's what Habitudes does. Habitudes are simply images that help form leadership habits and attitudes. And we have just found students learn through images, conversations, and experiences. And that's what we try to do. So I would say that is my strength, is to help put tools in the hands of educators to communicate these life skills that I think we desperately need to be taught today. And sometimes we're at a loss as to how to teach them to a young person.
Right. Well, so I know Habitudes and Marching Off the Map, fantastic books, and I'll make sure to put those in my show notes. But is there a book or two maybe that have really made a big impact on you?
Absolutely. I've got a ton. Let me just give you one or two real quick. One book that I read years ago, I try to reread every year. It's called Leadership and Self-Deception. Leadership and Self-Deception. It's by the Arbinger Institute. So it's a group of psychologists that wrote this book. And actually it's a parable. So it's a story, it's a narrative. But in this book, he talks about how most people are self-deceived. And at first you go, oh my gosh, is that overspeak? Is that hyperbole? But it's not, because you see this man, the main character of the book, go through this story. You start seeing how absolutely in the box and self-absorbed most of us are, and we're unaware. of that self-absorption. And it's not that we're evil. We're not robbing banks or committing murder. We just get selfish in our marriages, in our professions, with our colleagues. So that book I highly recommend. It's a fast read, but boy, is it's reminding me every time I read it, I need to make sure that I'm thinking about others, not myself, as I do my job. So that would be it. I also love Jim Collins' Good to Great. That was a great book.
Right.
I love, obviously working with John Maxwell. I love John's books. He's just such a great person to put leadership he kind of puts the cookies on the bottom shelf. So I love his books as well. I'll stop there.
Well, so the last question I have, if you had a time machine and you could jump in it and go back to the point in time when you first started your career and just started thinking about maybe, interest in leadership and leadership training, what advice would you go back and give to that younger version of yourself?
Wow. Jay, that is a great question. I think that I would try to learn the long-term implications of all my decisions. One of my mentors, current day, is Tim Elmore. He's the president of Chick-fil-A. And Tim has said to me before a great line, and I so buy into it. He said, the further out I can see into the future, the better the decisions I make today. Think about our work with students and with our own children. The further out I can see the ramifications of what I'm about to decide to do, the better the decision I make today. So moms and dads listening in, if I just want my child to be happy today, I make it easy for them today. If I want a great adult later, the decision may not be as easy today. You follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It may be I don't rush that backpack down to them because they forgot it. I let them problem solve at school about that backpack they forgot. So I would say I would probably talk to myself about the thinking long term, thinking big picture, thinking high road, take the high road with people, believe the best. That would be the kinds of things I would say to my earlier version that was in such a race to get to the top, and I'm not really thinking long term as much as I should.
Right. Play the long game, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so finally, if one of our listeners wants to reach out to you after the show, what would be the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, I can be reached at our website, probably first and foremost, easiest way. Our website is very simple. It's simply growingleaders.com. growingleaders.com. And I do a blog 3 times a week where I talk about these kinds of subjects. It's written for adults who work with kids. And then our Habitudes there, Marching Off the Map, all the stuff is there. And so I appreciate you asking, Jay. We would love to help and continue to add value to anybody that listened to this and found it helpful.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. EduLeaders, this has been a great interview today. For the show notes of today's show and other resources, visit educatorslead.com and type the word Tim into the search tool to find his show notes. Tim, thank you for sharing your journey with us today.
Jay, it was my pleasure, my honor to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode of Educators Lead. This podcast is brought to you by Mometrics, the #1 test preparation company. Mometrics offers study materials for over 1,800 different exams, including the SAT, ACT, GED, end-of-course exams, state standard exams like the STAR, teacher certification exams, advanced placement, CLEP, ASVAB, GRE, and so many more. Mometrics takes the mountains of information students could be tested over for any given exam and boils it all down to just the fluff-free golden nuggets of information that are most likely to be on the exam. They couple that with some great study tips and test-taking strategies to help students maximize their test scores. With their interactive tutorial videos and a layout that makes lesson planning easy, Mometrics study guides, flashcards, and practice questions are a great fit for individual or classroom use. To learn more about our products and our vault of hundreds of free tutorial videos, please visit educatorslead.com/test prep. That's educatorslead.com/test prep. EduLeaders, thank you for joining us on Educators Lead. Visit us at educatorslead.com for everything we talked about today, free resources, and much, much more.